Are you using PlanetScale? Is that right?
Yeah. So for SST uses our console uses PlanetScale. MySQL terminal also uses PlanetScale. The reason for this is we just love the workflow around schema changes. I think it eliminates the need for migrations, and it just provides a lot more comfort to making schema changes, knowing that nothing can go wrong.
What do you see about what works for marketing to devs?
If you spend a bunch of time building companies, you know that when you work on product, you have to go for really big swings that have a shot at being huge. For some reason, when it comes to marketing, we forget that mindset, and we just spend time on things that never has a shot of reaching a lot of people.
How do you position SST? What's unique about it even compared to some of those other ones? Hey folks, this is Alex, and I'm excited because today we have Dax Raad on the show. If you're on tech Twitter at all, you probably know Dax, bitingly funny humor that he has there, but also just a lot of really good tech opinions. I think he's a really smart developer and wise about a lot of things. So I was excited just to get his opinions on a ton of things, including hey, which cloud providers do you trust? Which services do you trust? Front end stuff, async jobs, different things like that. Just understanding hey, where are you sort of seeing the lay of the land? We also talked a lot about SST, which is the infrastructure as code tool that he works on. They've got a new engine called Ion that's releasing. So we talked about what that sort of looked like, what those changes are like, and how that's going to help users. We also just talked about marketing to developers, because I think he's got a unique take on that. So a lot of interesting stuff here. If you have any guests that you want on or questions or anything like that, feel free to reach out to me or to Sean. But with that, let's get to the show. Dax, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Glad to be on.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm excited to have you here. I'm assuming a lot of people know you, but I think you're just a top tier Twitter follow in terms of, legit, strong, but legit good tech opinions and things like that, but also just getting kicked in the teeth every once in a while from some hard stuff. So I'm excited to have you on to talk about some of that tech stuff. But I want to start off talking about SST first, which you're on the team for. So maybe for everyone, just give a little background on you and SST, and then we'll dive into some stuff around that.
Yeah, so I've been an engineer for, I think, probably, I would say my official start date, I could say 2012. So it's been, I guess, 12 years. Pretty much always worked in very early stage, either as a founder or the first hire. Founded a few companies, failed a bunch, et cetera, that whole thing. My history with building stuff as an engineer, because I was at these early stage companies, there wasn't any division between you do application, you do infrastructure. So I kind of always did a lot of the infrastructure work. And my approach to infrastructure was always, how can I maximize what's out there so I can do as little as possible and this can be most automated as possible, because that was never my main job. Despite that approach, I never really discovered all the real serverless AWS stuff until much later. I used to build in a very cloud agnostic way. I think my approach was more, I want to learn stuff once and then be able to run it everywhere. And that was my sense on, that's how I lower my own burden. But in 2019, I was just kind of bored of how I was doing things. So I tried the opposite extreme and really try to learn AWS as much as I can. Discovered the whole serverless community. This project called SST was just getting started. The idea behind it at the time was really small. It was just, let's take some of the best components in AWS, wrap it up in a nice package, give you a good local dev experience, and you can pretty much build a lot just with 5 or 6 things that are in AWS. I ended up investing in that team, and I ended up joining the team a few months later. And it's been 3 years now, and our scope is massively expanded to helping you deploy literally anything. But I think the twist for us is we use a lot of the tools that DevOps people and DevOps teams are very familiar with and already use. But we're trying to kind of trick application developers to start using those things, because I think as much as infrastructure as code and things like that are well understood, almost no application developers even know anything about that stuff still. And I think letting them tap into some of the crazy infrastructure that's out there so they can kind of fully build and deploy their app, we think there's a large opportunity there still. So that's what we focus on.
Yeah, for sure. And so I'm guessing people are familiar with some sort of infrastructure as code framework, whether that's CloudFormation or Terraform or something higher level like CDK or SAM or serverless framework. I guess like what's unique about, how do you position SST? Like what's unique about it even compared to some of those other ones?
Yeah, so obviously infrastructure as code has existed. We're nowhere close to inventing it. Like we don't actually build any of the infrastructure as code pieces. I think it's just the mindset with how these things are designed. I think most of these tools, their primary concern is breadth. Like they need to make sure for every possible resource that exists in a provider, every single configuration option, there is a one-to-one mapping of that in the infrastructure as code tool. What the downside of that is there's no like on-ramp or like progressive disclosure with that. If you want to go create a resource, you are now seeing 20 options. You don't know that only 3 of them are relevant in like 95% of cases. So for us, we look at, that's one side of things. We try to create like a nice on-ramp where you can create some of these resources. We do simplify, like, do you necessarily need to know that when you create a queue in a Lambda, there's like this other resource in between that integrates the two together and like all these little details?
Yeah.
We don't think that a lot of people need to know that right away. That said, if you build anything that is that grows and gets more complicated, you will eventually need to get into those details and dig into them. So we like that bottom layer because it's really powerful, but we try to like give you a nice on-ramp onto it. And the other side is, again, because these tools are built for DevOps teams, there's no like, they don't think about the dev experience because there isn't as much of a dev experience. It's more like, yes, you're deploying infrastructure, yes, you're going to be making changes, but it's very different than working on an application every single day, which might need infrastructure changes every single day. But a lot of our focus is doing some pretty crazy stuff on like the local dev. I mean, local in quotes, more like just your development process and how it looks day to day. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. When I think of early SST, I think of live Lambda and just like how big that was. Or it's like, hey, you can like be running your Lambda function code locally, but still like getting almost the full Lambda experience in terms of like IAM permissions and all that sort of stuff to work. I guess like, did that drive a ton of early adoption? Like were there other things that were sort of like that other tools weren't doing?
Yeah. So if you're trying to launch a new framework or launch any product, really, you need some obvious hook where people will see it and they'll be like, I recognize that problem. I need to drop everything and go try it. If we hadn't come up with live Lambda, we would have never been able to do anything else because there's no reason that, at that time, the serverless framework was around, CDK was around, and it was early for CDK. But if you just enter the market with a framework that was similar and maybe even was better, it's not obvious. So live Lambda was huge. And even to this day, I think what we see happens a lot is, especially on larger teams, a single person on a larger team will get into SST and they'll understand like the full breadth of why, they like it and like what it does well. But when they pitch it to their team, who are, usually very skeptical, the thing that sells them to this day is a live Lambda thing. Because it's just such a painful workflow that pain's existed forever. And yeah, just being able to like hit save on a file and then see the changes within like, milliseconds is that clicks for people immediately.
Yeah. And like local debugging and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, it's pretty wild. Was V1 of SST, was that on CDK or was that only V2?
The first V0 was a fork of CDK and I hated that. So when I joined, I was like, how can we possibly get this to not be a fork? And then eventually it wasn't a fork. It was just something that went side by side with CDK. You installed CDK and you installed SST. Then V2, we were just kind of refining like our patterns that exist in it. And then we eventually ejected off of CDK, which is Ion, which was experimental initially, but now it's going to be promoted to V3.
Yep. Okay. So tell me about Ion. What's the big difference there from previous versions of SST? So going back to this idea that a lot of these tools are designed for DevOps teams, again, with the idea of like perfectly mapping to the underlying resources. If you look at CDK's approach, as fancy of a thing as it seems, at the end of the day, it's a code generator. It's a YAML generator. It generates YAML for you. And that is like somewhat of a paradigm mismatch because you're programming
code that looks like it executes sequentially. It looks like you can have something happen after something else does, but it can't because it just gets run once and turned into YAML, which then gets sent to AWS to be deployed. And that mismatch leads to like an incredibly large set of problems. It's like the root issue for a lot of things that happen. I think again, if you're a DevOps team, this probably isn't a big deal for you. But if you're an application developer, you do have a much more complex chain of things that can happen. You might have situations where a lot of these modern front-end frameworks, they do a lot of stuff at build time. So the build shouldn't happen until certain resources are deployed, like even your database. Sometimes builds depend on a database. I mean, I don't necessarily like that pattern, but it is just a thing that is true now to generate these large static sites. So being able to wait on a thing being deployed before you do something that seems local, like a build, that approach just cannot happen with a code generator. And we have like 100 of these issues that kind of fall into this category, and almost all of them were in like the initial, like a new user trying out SST would run into these issues in the first couple of weeks, and it was very painful for us to be like, yeah, I know it's a bad experience, but we can't fix it. Like, it's a worse situation to be in. But we realized we needed to switch engines that gave us a lot more control over how a lot of this stuff works. Like being able to make tweaks around, I think again, like things like CloudFormation are really optimized for make sure a production deployment never goes wrong for like any company on earth, no matter the size, which is very different than someone locally just working on something. Like, you don't need that level of security. So like being able to like own that process and have more control of it was really important for us. So we ended up switching our core engine to Pulumi. To be honest, we didn't really understand a lot of what I just told you until we started using Pulumi. Because for a long time we just assumed, oh yeah, they're just also a code generator, like they're just code to Terraform type of thing. But it turns out they're not. It's like the program you write is actually what gets executed, and like the stuff you write in sequential order, it actually is happening in sequential order. So you can really control, this needs to happen, then that needs to happen.
Yep. So like you didn't understand that till you got in. Like, did that unlock some things that you didn't even think were possible? Like when you're like, hey, we're switching to Pulumi for Ion, and then it's like, oh man, this is even better than we thought.
Yeah. So early on, when we were like, we definitely want to explore switching engines, in like a 24-hour window, we were able to build a TypeScript to Terraform generator. It's pretty easy. It's like not anything that hard. And we were like, oh yeah, this basically is like the underlying thing that we can build everything on. Very simple. And really randomly, the Pulumi CEO saw my tweet about something and just sent like a nice message being like, oh, we like what you guys are doing. We've been following your stuff. And I was like, oh, you want to chat sometime? And we started talking, and I found out on the call, because his co-founder joined, Luke, who worked on TypeScript. And I was like, oh, I didn't know that like someone that worked on TypeScript like shifted to this space. And they were telling me more about their stuff. And I was like, okay, I need to like give this a real try before we go off and do our own thing. Then when I started using it, I was like, whoa, they solved so many of these underlying things, and it's fundamentally a completely different paradigm. And it really wasn't obvious to me from the outside at all. Like, it looked very similar to all the other stuff, but there's a lot of great ideas in it, and it's super simple. Simple in the sense that once you get it, there's only like 2 or 3 concepts, and they compose together to like everything you possibly need. So once that clicked, I was like, okay, like we got to use this because we're never going to build anything better.
Yeah. What is, like, you mentioned the CEO and CTO like sort of reaching out to help you. Like, what does Pulumi get out of SST being built on it? Like, do you hook into some of their tooling in any way that would be like potentially helpful for them in the future? Or what's that look like?
There was a meeting we had where I straight up was like, why are you guys helping us so much? Because they created a Slack channel, like both of them were responding like very actively in there. And I'm like, this is like, we love it and we appreciate it. And this is amazing. We're able to move way faster than we've ever moved with CDK. But like, we didn't really understand it. I think it's pretty indirect for them because we're not necessarily like directly driving people into their cloud product or anything. I think they built this thing called the automation API, which is a way to programmatically use Pulumi, which to me, I'm like, they literally built it for us. Like that's what it feels like. Like who else really needs to like programmatically bring? I mean, it does happen. Like there are other cases. I see why they did it. But when they were building it, they were hoping, like they really wanted to see the full vision out of something like SST would choose to build on this. So I think for them, it was just kind of seeing that vision through. I think the most direct thing I can say is there's a lot more eyeballs on Pulumi from an audience that doesn't really look at this stuff at all. There's more eyes on their providers. I've actually seen someone contribute a bug fix to Pulumi from our community. So I think over time there's just more mind share around this stuff. So it's not very direct, but I think from that angle it can make sense.
Gotcha. Okay, and so I know Pulumi like supports any Terraform provider. How much of Pulumi is using Terraform as like the lowest layer, almost like CDK uses CloudFormation, or versus like is there a lot of just like Pulumi native stuff you can use Pulumi native providers rather than using Terraform at all?
Yeah, so the Pulumi engine, like the infrastructure as code engine, is 100% their own thing. You can have Pulumi native providers. There's almost like nothing major is really a Pulumi native provider. I'm sure there are maybe some that I'm forgetting, but most are adapted Terraform providers. So I think their approach was build an engine, but then just tap into the existing ecosystem of providers. But besides that, there's really not coupling there.
Yeah. And is there like a separate state management than Terraform? Like, are they using Terraform state management?
No, that's all completely separate. They're just they take different approaches to that stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Is there anything you miss about CloudFormation or CDK, or are you just like, no, this is great?
Well, it's funny because our console is still a CV2 app, and we had to go work on it a bunch to add support for Ion, but we haven't migrated it to Ion yet. So it was funny dropping back down into that. And I think if I dig really hard, I'm like, what do I like? The straight up answer is no. Like it's just so slow. Like there's so many weird things that happen. There's just once you get used to Ion, it just feels like really taking a big step back. But it is like a native thing in AWS. So you can go to the console and see like your stack and see stuff. And that feels a little bit more secure than like a purely like client side tool that's creating stuff in your AWS account. That's a big reason we have to go and work on the console, because the console now becomes your source of truth for all your deployments, all of your state, what state every resource is in, which is it's actually way better than CloudFormation, but there is like a safety thing that you feel when it's in your AWS console.
Yep. Okay, so if I'm migrating from V2 to Ion, like how hard is that migration going to be?
Yeah, it's pretty challenging. We actually just wrote our migration guide, and it's like our first take on it. So using the migration guide, we're going to attempt to move our console over, and I mean, just frankly, it's not an easy process. The reality is it's like a very different system. The one thing that makes it easy is Pulumi can import resources like without compromise, whereas imports in CloudFormation was always like a difficult process. Halfway. Also, like random stuff just wasn't importable. So again, giving us the ability to bring anything in makes a migration like at all viable. It's pretty different than, I mean, other migrations have been happening, right? Like a bunch of people that were on serverless framework moved to SST, and they managed to do that without even imports. So it's going to be hard because it involves infrastructure, but the importing thing does soften it a little bit.
Yep. Like, what's your plan for V2 and like long-term maintenance? Like, will you still sort of work on V2, understanding that like some people aren't going to migrate, or like, how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I think V2 at this point we consider done, in that there's like we just started to hit ceilings, which is why we started to look at something else. Like anything that we continued to want to do, any problems we wanted to solve, was just not possible in V2. So we keep updating it for new CDK versions and fixing whatever is there, but we're not going to be developing any new features. We're pretty good about merging, and we're okay about merging PRs, but it'll probably be community maintained at this point.
Yeah. And so when you did the V1 to V2, like, are there still a lot of people on V1, or did most migrate and it's sort of done there? Or what did that look like going through this before?
V1 to V2 was like not that crazy of a switch. It was just a bunch of breaking changes in your code, not so much like fateful stuff you have to manage. We just had to introduce some new patterns and clean stuff up. So yeah, I think anyone with anything significant is on V2.
Gotcha. And will console support V2 and Ion for a while, or will you sort of just like roll off V2 after a while?
Yeah, right now it supports both. I don't see any need to drop V2 support. We were able to segment it in our backend pretty well. I think the future of the console is that it's going to run in your own AWS account, and most of the work is going to run in your AWS account. I don't think we'll bring that to V2. I think that's going to be an Ion only thing.
Gotcha. What does that look like, from a business standpoint, if people are running console in their account? I guess, like, how do you all make money? What's your plan there?
Yeah, so this is like a weird thing about us that's totally different from like traditional software companies. We could actually bring our cost to zero. Right now, our costs really come from our console, which processes your logs to handle issues. That's like the big bulk of our costs. But our new CI feature, auto deploy, that doesn't run in our account. That just runs on code build in your account. So we have zero cost for servicing that feature. And we really should move our log processing into your account as well. What's great about this is there's a few benefits. Our costs are zero. Big companies need this anyway because they don't want to ship their stuff to a random third party. So you have to do that anyway. And I think that allows us for some interesting pricing. So we'll still charge for it. If you want to fully self-host it with zero help from us, I think that's always going to be like, we're not going to charge for that, of course. But most serious companies, even if they're running in their account, they want like some kind of guarantee. So that's where we'll charge. But it's literally 100% like profit for us. We have no cost of operating it. So we really plan on driving these costs like down continuously. Again, because our team is small, it just takes very little for us to keep going. So for us, whatever gets us more people using it, we'll do. Yeah.
You say log processing. Is that like, are you in the console? Are you indexing logs and then they're like searchable in the console?
No, so we're not doing that, which is why our logs feature is not great because it's capped by what AWS can natively do. So I think we've done a better job than what you would get by going to the CloudWatch logs. We group stuff by invocation. We like pull stuff out. We do as much as you can on top of the underlying capabilities. But for our issues feature, that one, we basically add a log subscriber. So anytime we deploy an SST, anything ST related, we look at all the log groups and we add a subscriber looking for anything that looks like an error. Gotcha. And those events are sent to us. We analyze them. We'll apply your source map to it, and then we'll pull out what looks like a Sentry like error with the stack trace. And we even show you like source maps get uploaded, so we show you the exact code where it broke. And what's nice about this is it just works out of the box. There's nothing to you don't have to wrap your handlers and stuff.
Yeah.
Just deploy and it just works. So it's a useful feature, and yeah, we just want everyone to have that without having to go sign up and set up the console.
I've seen you talk about this multiplexer that you've been working on recently. Like, what's going on there? What's the multiplexer?
Yeah, so this seems like a super random feature, but the idea here is when you, again, going back to the focus on application developers, when you bring up an SST app, there's a lot of components. There is the actual infrastructure that's getting deployed. There's your functions, which is probably serving some kind of API. And you might have your front end that also needs to be brought up, which might be like a Vite app or like a Next.js app, whatever it is. And you might have some like additional stuff that's helpful, like a tunnel, like a SSH tunnel to your database, just other tasks that you need to bring up. And we found it really difficult to create an easy experience around that, because it's like you can't bring up your front end until you bring up SST, because your front end needs to know about values about what your API is. And there's this whole coordination. We had to like open up several terminals and start things up in the right order. And we wanted to give you an experience where you just run SC dev and everything in your application is pulled up into a single window. But that required like really understanding how terminals work, which I had no idea until a couple months ago. So we have like a nice switcher, everything gets brought up. You can add your own commands too. So I've been doing some interesting stuff where like Drizzle, the ORM for JavaScript, they have like Drizzle Studio, which you can bring up locally and have like a database explorer in your browser. That gets brought up automatically, and like all the values that it needs gets injected automatically. So it's like a really nice experience. And again, it's one of those things where solving that solved like a dozen downstream issues and bugs that people run into and places where they get stuck or confused.
Yep. And that's like, I imagine that was like pretty difficult. How did that take you to build that out?
Yeah, it was one of those things where it was funny. We were talking about this the other day because once we got it out, we're like, oh, this actually worked out. But the process of it was, I kept vaguely talking about it like every couple of weeks, being like, oh, we should try that. Or like, I've been messing around with like figuring out how that could work. And Frank was like, yeah, every time you brought that up, in my head, I was just like, there's no way this is ever going to work or it's going to happen. And to be fair, I also felt that way because it just is one of those things where you're like, oh, I can sit at this level of abstraction and build this. And you find out, no, you can't. You have to go one level lower. You do that for a couple of weeks. No, you can't. You do that one level lower. So eventually you just end up hitting the bottom. But what's weird is the bottom is actually the simplest place to be, because once you know how it works, like you have full control over everything. So it was just this process of like just getting pushed further and further down. And it was something I would dabble with like every couple of weeks. When I had some time, a couple hours, I would mess with it and I'd make a little bit more progress in my understanding of how all this stuff worked. And then eventually there was a week where I was like, okay, I know for sure we can do this now. And I just like spent a week just building it over and over and over again. And eventually we got it to work. I will say a big part of what drove us, and it's funny, I think a lot of product happens this way. Like we've been talking about this and thinking about this forever, but it always felt like too crazy or too difficult to be worth it. And then Turbo Repo shipped it because they're one of the other products that have the same problem, in that they don't manage a single thing in your code base. They like bring up all kinds of stuff like front end, back end tests. So they basically have the exact same problem, and they shipped a multiplexer. And once I saw that, I was like, okay, now we have to do it. Because one, you see it and you're like, are we just going to not have it now? Now that we know for sure it's possible. But it was really fun at the end of the day. Like it was really, I think programming has gotten pretty abstracted these days. So this was like a nice reversion to like really basic stuff. Like when you scroll up, like you have to move these lines forward and you have to pop these lines out. And then how do you like, it's like really basic. It's the type of like interview questions I think you would get, which aren't necessarily good interview questions, but it is like kind of fun, puzzly stuff to work on.
Yep. Cool. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit. And I want to do just like tech thoughts. I have a bunch of areas where I just want to get your opinions kind of gathered up. So first of all, let's start with cloud providers. I know you have like, you have support for Cloudflare. You've talked about Cloudflare for a while. Like, is Cloudflare ready? Like how and where should I be using Cloudflare?
Yeah, so I think right now with Ion, because our big thing was we added support for not just AWS, like pretty much all providers, and we've done some nice things. It's funny, the place where it's massively used is we provide a really easy way where when you spin up, let's say like a CloudFront distribution, or you spin up a front end that involves a CloudFront distribution, you can easily just say, actually, my DNS is hosted by Cloudflare. So everything still lives in AWS, but then the DNS and certificate validation is done with Cloudflare. This ends up being a massively popular setup because so many people use Cloudflare for just DDoS protection, like the thing that they're known for. It's pretty interesting because like they obviously started that a long time ago. And these days, like anything public facing just gets hit. Like no matter how small you are, you like just deal with this problem. So it's almost become like a fundamental thing. Like you need to have something in front of all your stuff. So I think this is an example of how a lot of deployments, even if they're primarily in AWS, eventually need to mix in, even in a small place like that, need to mix in something else. So that's where we're seeing a lot of initial traction. But then obviously Cloudflare is trying to build a platform, which build your whole thing on Cloudflare. Is it ready yet for most applications? I don't think so. And I can explain a little bit why on that. But they also know this. Like they know, I think they publicly say, like, we know building a platform takes 10 years. I think they're on like year 8 or something like that. I think they're close, but there's a few problems right now. So I say primitive wise, they have everything. Like they have a lot of really cool stuff. It's a very small surface area. You can pretty much build whatever you want. I think the entire challenge right now is the database. So if you want to do fully Cloudflare native, your option is D1 if you want relational stuff. They have their KV store. It's nowhere near as robust or like capable as Dynamo. So it's not really a comparison. It's more like a simple KV store, not really meant for like primary application data. They use D1, which is their like SQLite offering. D1 isn't really viable for most apps. There's like a 20 gig limit or something on it, or like a 10 gig limit on it. There's all sorts of gotchas. I personally don't know how much I believe in like SQLite underpinning like primary database offerings for someone like Cloudflare, but that is the option you have right now. But there are a lot of really good database providers out there that you can use outside of Cloudflare. And it's not a big deal, right? You can use PlanetScale, you can use whatever, all the different Postgres hosts. But the issue is almost all of those databases are hosted in AWS. PlanetScale's in AWS. Like all these big deployments are in AWS. So you incur a latency penalty going from Worker to AWS, which kind of defeats the point of using Workers, which is like all about performance and speed and all that stuff. So today, that's the problem. It's not, the latency issue isn't like a geographic problem where they can never fix it. It's actually there's currently Worker traffic goes to this older path that's just less efficient. As they migrated onto the newer path, you'll start to see latencies that are like pretty good. I think once they do that, I have a hard time saying that, yeah, you can't build an application there that's just as good as or better as AWS.
Yeah. How do you like the Worker compute paradigm as compared to Lambda or Fargate or something else?
Yeah, so I think obviously if you're coming from Lambda, it's pretty familiar, like the whole stateless stuff. It's even more stateless. I think with Lambda, you can obviously cheat by having stuff like outside your handler function. But Workers, it really forces you to treat it like more purely as just a function. Obviously, some benefits come from that. The downsides are like, you imagine all the mental model problems people run into, like moving from a container to Lambda, just like wrapping their head around, okay, things are a little bit different here. There's a similar shift, I think, going from Lambda to Worker, because it's just even more in that extreme. Obviously, not all the Node.js APIs work. It's not really Node.js. It's the compatibility layer. That they're closing the gap on that quickly, though, and they're investing a lot there. So I think it's just going to get better and better. So those are the downsides. But the CPU billing, I think, is great. I think most applications are like 80% waiting on network anyway. So price-wise, it's just super cheap. A lot of the pain points I've run into Lambda is just making calls to very slow third parties that just increase my bills for no reason. So you can do a lot of interesting things like delivering webhooks, stuff like that. It becomes a lot easier. They are still, like, some of their stuff is still in beta. So the things you need alongside your compute, like queues, and they have this new workflow thing, which is like a much better version of step functions, basically. You just write normal code. Again, still in beta, still early. But like, when you actually try to like use all these things together, you get like glimpses of like how good it can be. So still very early adopter type thing, but overall, I'm like very excited about building something real on it.
Yep. On that last note, I've heard you talking about workflows being in code rather than like, some DSL like step functions. Do you just generally prefer writing stuff in code rather than like declarative? Like if I look at SST compared to Service Framework or SAM, and then also these workflows compared to step functions, that's your short go-to?
Yeah, I think our fundamental thing is we don't want to take you out of an environment that you're used to. So most programmers spend all day in their editor writing code. Editors have all this investment in them to make them good at doing a lot of things, autocomplete, documentation, all that stuff is built in. We know how to collaborate on code. Like we know about Git, we know about pull requests, we know about branching, we know about testing. So I think there's a lot about code that's very, very well understood and just old. Like it's old and very established. And I think with a lot of these new paradigms, they can seem exciting and because they show you how you can build the thing you want to, but it's missing all this other stuff that augments code. Even basic things like obviously giving people the ability to write abstractions often backfires, but just hypothetically, we know how to write abstractions in code. We know how to progressively disclose in code. Much less clear or basically impossible to do that in config-based things. So our entire approach is to keep you in the environment that you're familiar with. And we take this beyond just other infrastructure as code stuff. We believe this about other infrastructure products as well. A lot of products try to simplify things by moving things into a dashboard. And I think the classic example I can think of is Retool. So if you look at something like Retool, the pitch is, here's a drag and drop UI thing in your browser that you can use. You don't have to write code, and you can build internal tools, etc. And that's a promise. Like non-engineers can use it, and it's going to make your team more productive. What inevitably always ends up happening is it's still kind of technical, so the engineering team still has to deal with it. And now all of a sudden they're in this completely alien environment managing stuff. So I think this shows up a lot. A lot of infrastructure products are UI based, and you're suddenly jumping into something else to configure stuff. And UIs are really bad at dealing with complexity. They just are simple to start off with because they target a simple use case. Over time, UIs always get bloated. Everyone complains about this as product gets older. It's just filled with stuff that you don't care about. But yeah, we try to keep you in code. We think code is very good.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, you mentioned earlier around workers billing model and just billing on CPU. I guess do you see a lot of your larger customers where the cost of Lambda starts to be a problem?
Yeah, even for us, right? Our issue processing thing is 80% of our bill. 80% of our bill is just Lambda compute. And I don't know if that problem would necessarily be fixed by workers, but it is a significant thing. And I think what we are interested in is giving people a seamless way to start moving some workloads onto workers, even if their whole app isn't there. And Cloudflare themselves, that's also their next milestone. They want to see people progressively moving stuff there. Like I said, obviously not everything makes sense, but I think it's very common to have a high bill from IO weight. And I think AWS can also just fix this overnight if they just allow Lambda to serve concurrently. I think that basically gets you the same thing, and maybe the traction of workers just kind of goes away pretty quickly. I know they're kind of already talking about that internally. But yeah, as of now, it's attractive for that reason. Yeah.
What about, do you see people moving to containers instead when Lambda starts to get too expensive, or are they still just the ease of Lambda is sort of worth it?
Yeah. So a big thing with Ion is we really focus on our container support, and we're going to continue to improve it. It's actually pretty good now. I'm really happy with it. We're using it for our terminal coffee thing. That's kind of what we built it for. And containers are pretty easy these days. They're not so bad. I think a lot of what's great about Lambda is more the integrations versus the compute model itself. Very easy to put a Lambda at the end of a queue. A little bit more annoying to do that with a container. And plus, now you multiply that with all the services that exist. So yeah, we do see people moving to containers after a certain level. So for us, again, with our workload, we've known for a while if we move to containers, our costs would drop a lot, but we just don't want to deal with that. We still like whatever extra costs we're paying for this event-based model. We like the mental model, and it does simplify a lot of things.
Can you process log subscriptions with a container, or is that only, or like how do you handle a subscription filter if
so that ends up in a
I guess?
Kinesis thing. So anything that can process. So this specific case, I think it demonstrates what Lambda is good at. So we receive a log event and we find an error in it, and then we need to apply source maps to it. The source map applying a source map is a very memory intensive thing. And some people's code is tiny and it's not. Some people's code is massive and it's like a big memory thing. The memory isolation properties of Lambda is like perfect for something like this, because we don't have to worry about some big company spitting out 10,000 errors and the container just focusing entirely on that and not dealing with other people's stuff, right? So the resource contention stuff, I think people always forget about this, but that's one of the main reasons why we end up using Lambda in a lot of cases.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, you mentioned better container support. Is that on Fargate? Is it like on ECS or EKS, or like how is Ion running containers?
Yeah, so we are committing to Fargate, and we have a lot of our work, like we've done a million times before, is just trying every possible configuration to figure out like what is a good default. So with containers, there's like a combination of things. It's like, what's the best VPC setup? What's the best ECS setup? What's the best service discovery setup? There's like many ways you can configure all these things. So we want to create a situation where you can create a cluster. You can very easily add services, which we can do today. What we're working on now is those services should be able to discover each other in a sane way. A demo that we really want to do is we want to show how you can deploy an Elixir application. When you scale the Elixir application, it automatically clusters with all the other containers because Elixir has clustering. For people in the Elixir world, setting up clustering is so powerful, but a lot of people don't do it just because it involves a lot of infrastructure know-how. So yeah, just like going into each ecosystem and figuring out what's like the best container experience we can deliver.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, switch it up a little bit. What about, I know like event-driven applications have gotten sort of popular and things like that. I guess like where do you see event-driven, and especially like do you use a lot of Event Bridge? Like what do you think of that versus more like SQS or just like straight queue-based stuff?
Yeah, so we still really like Event Bridge. We have our type-safe bus implementation. It's in Ion and just not documented yet, but it's one of those things where so we famously haven't documented two things, our auth and our event stuff. And it's become a running joke because literally every single day someone is like, I want to move, but I'm waiting for this. I want to move, but I'm waiting for this. So people still really like events. I think we tend to use them in a very light way. And I think that's our general pattern with everything. Like we like this stuff, we use it in like the lightest way possible. So we emit events, everything into an event bus. For terminal or coffee thing, I'm trying this new pattern where we only have a single subscriber and there's a big switch statement in it that just switches between different events. So obviously we lose some of the observability benefits, but I think for a lot of applications, like this is good enough because what they're looking to do just offload async work to something. And having to go set up a new subscription and new patterns and all that for every single event is a lot more tedious than just going and adding another case in their switch statement. So yeah, we still like it, but we don't go crazy with it.
What do you, when you said Ion publishes a bunch of events, like what do you do and react? How do you react to those? Like, what are you doing with those events?
I mean, so what we meant is we have a framework to define events in your application and the shape of them using Zod or Valibot or any of those schema tools. And then your consumers will get them in a validated with the right shape, and it's all type safe and all of that. And we found when we gave people those tools, like they use it a lot. So people do like events.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, switching again. I used to hear a lot about tRPC. I feel like I hear about it less. Is tRPC still a thing? Do you like tRPC? Where are we at with that?
So I actually never really used it. We have a lot of people that do use it. I was helping someone yesterday that was setting up a tRPC thing. What I've been using a lot for my APIs is Hono, which is it's like a Express alternative, but it runs everywhere. Like it runs in Lambda, it runs in Cloudflare, and it's crazy performant, crazy fast, crazy lightweight. It's really cool. And they have this cool like tRPC like thing built in where they will give you a type that you can import into your front end. And that gives you like this type safe client on your front end off normal REST endpoints. So off just GET, POST, etc., which is very cool. And they also have native Open API support, which we're using for Terminal, which is it's very, very good. The Open API stuff is great. So we're generating Go SDKs off of that. There's actually even going to be a public API for buying coffee.
Nice. A much more user-friendly way than the current way, right? Rather than SSH, now you can just use a REST API to order your coffee.
Yeah.
So, yeah, cool. Okay, what about databases? I guess like what sort of database are you using? PlanetScale, is that right?
Yeah, so for SST our console uses PlanetScale, MySQL. Terminal also uses PlanetScale. The reason for this is we just love the workflow around schema changes. I think it eliminates the need for migrations, and it just provides a lot more comfort to making schema changes, knowing that nothing can go wrong. Plus all the observability stuff that they do, plus all the like the insight stuff they do. Like overall, it's interesting because the reason they exist is to handle these like top 0.1% scale sites. But as a side effect, they've just built a very good platform for even stuff that isn't at that scale. So that's why I use it. That said, I feel the database space is still very unsatisfying, I think. I think PlanetScale is a great option for MySQL. I don't think there is a great option in AWS still. We're not looking for like the freest option ever. We just look for reasonable situations that you can start and grow with. Whereas in AWS with RDS, like it's pretty expensive when you add in the VPCs and the NAT and then your database on top. Like the entry fee is pretty high, and that just it just creates friction for new people adopting AWS and like learning, and there's all kinds of problems with it. I know they're going to fix it, but yeah, right now there's a gap.
Yep. Do you trust any? I guess are there any other database providers outside of AWS and outside of PlanetScale that you feel like are doing pretty well, or that you would trust?
Everything I've been talking about is only on relational databases. I silly talk about that because for mass market, like you need to. That's like what people need. The answer is no, honestly. I think there's a lot of like traditional Postgres hosts that are great, like Crunchy Data or like even Supabase. Like I think just giving you a straight up Postgres instance that you can rely on. I think there's great ones there. But something that like PlanetScale feels kind of like next gen, where it's like a new architecture, more focused on like being able to connect to it from Lambda and workers, which, you might have 1,000 of them running, and the connection point, all that stuff is just fixed and hidden from you. I don't feel like there's a lot on the relational database side. It still feels like a big gap, and there's a lot of reasons for it, but yeah, it's been a pain point.
Yep. How do you feel about just like MySQL generally, and maybe the direction of that? Does that make you worry at all?
It's weird because I wasn't really a SQL person for a long time. I worked on pretty much all NoSQL stuff for most of my career. Then I did a bunch of Postgres stuff, and I was like, okay, I get it. Then I switched to MySQL, which has like almost no features compared to Postgres. And initially that was annoying, but over time it kind of felt like Dynamo, where there's like a very small feature set and you just use it correctly and you're never going to have any like surprises. So I really like that attribute of MySQL. And it's just used by like the largest deployments in the world. And that makes me not worry about it. It's so old too. So yeah, I don't really worry about anything from that regard. I think Postgres, I've gotten to the point where it's just too much for me. So I try to stick to MySQL where I can.
Interesting. So do you think like a lot of the Postgres energy is just because like it's saying yes to everything and it just like has a ton of features and things like that?
Yeah, it's great for application developers. Like if you're building an application and you want to do more stuff in the database, it has like an extension for everything. It's got like just so much. And I think that's a trade-off that they made, where MySQL is really focused on making it easy to operate and focus on teams that were operating it. And then they kind of slowly chase Postgres on like features application developers want. But yeah, that said, like, if you're using Postgres in a normal deployment, there's a lot of stuff you can tap into. It just comes down to, I think, taste. I just have, like I said, I like code, and I think people are good at managing code. So I like to do some more stuff in my application than in my database. I have tried the extreme of doing a lot in the database, and I see the upsides of that, but it just doesn't really click for me.
Yep, for sure. What about, so I know you were like an early proponent of Drizzle. What do you love about Drizzle?
Yeah, I think it's been crazy to see their growth. It's they're like getting integrated into like all these big companies now. It's pretty wild. It's just, a team of 3. Yeah, I think what my sense is, I like query builders over ORMs, which, isn't like an objective thing. Some people like ORMs, which is fine. But I believe the right abstraction has a query builder at the bottom. Like something that helps you build something that looks a lot like the raw SQL in a type safe way, helping you where you can. I think they got that right. I think they got their adapter pattern right, so that it can work with all kinds of stuff. Like it's being used from anything from like SQLite to like to Postgres to MySQL to very specific deployments of like HTTP based Postgres. You can do like their adapter layer is super powerful, and it's scaled to all these different scenarios. So early on, they had both of those, but like a lot of features were missing. But because they had both those, I knew that they would just grow into the rest. And they have, and they can build now an ORM, like a Prisma like ORM layer on top, which they have built. And they're still like iterating on that and reworking. But again, this layered approach of raw stuff at the bottom, as raw as possible, and kind of build up to the higher level stuff. So when you need to drop down, you can. I think especially working on SST, that's like a thing I started to care a lot more about, because I just see how people have to eject out of things all the time because they eventually outgrow it.
Yeah. You mentioned SQLite a few times. Like, what do you think about the SQLite moment that we're seeing?
To be honest, I'm not super into it. So I think here's a pattern that I follow. I did one product where we didn't use a traditional database. We used something called LMDB, which is like SQLite. It's like a single file on disk, super, super, super fast, very limited in what it can do, but really, really fast. And we had a deployment curve per customer. So every customer got their own file. A lot of upsides to this. Like performance was crazy. It's basically like almost like it's in memory. A lot of it gets loaded into memory. And simplicity, et cetera. But the amount of tooling we had to build around it was kind of crazy. Like, okay, you have this, managing these different things. Okay, but it's a single file. You have to make sure you back it up. Okay, now someone wants to do analytics across all of your customers' data because you have that internal need and you need to replicate it into some kind of, OLAP thing. Obviously, there's no out of the box things that will ship like a file to one of those things. You need to debug something. Like some data looks messed up in one customer's instance. You can't just go open a client and connect to it. You have to now go like SSH into it. So I feel like SQLite itself, it's incredible because it's meant for cases where a single file is enough. Embedded devices, like all these situations where it is massively used. But now when people are trying to use it to underpin or to replace a traditional database, they're rebuilding all the stuff that traditional databases have. Like, okay, instead of it being a file, it's now a hosted thing wrapped with an API. Okay, that now you've lost the simplicity of just a file. It's now another service that can go down. Okay, you need backups. You have to install a thing called Lightstream and replicate it into S3. So I think, you can get all this stuff working, but I see it just reapproaching more and more a traditional database without the ecosystem of it, right? There's way more things that can plug into your MySQL database and ship it somewhere else and do ETL and all that than there is in SQLite. So for me, the stuff that I work on, it doesn't meaningfully change stuff. I'm sure there's some cases where it does, but I just slowly see them rebuilding a traditional database.
Yeah, very good. Yep. Interesting. Okay, what about the front end world right now? How do you feel about our options in the front end world? Like, are you totally off React? Is that right?
Yeah, I haven't used React in like almost 3 years now.
Okay, sounds good. And so, are you Astro or what are you using?
No, I use Solid.js. Everything we've built has been on Solid. It's just something that clicks for us, and I think it's really well designed. I think it really massively simplifies a lot of stuff that goes wrong in React apps. In fact, I didn't really understand what was going wrong in all my React apps until I started using Solid. I knew stuff was going wrong. I didn't get why every single one was eventually becoming a mess. That said, I think we're in this really like crappy phase right now. I think there was a time where I feel like there's moods to our industry. There's a collective mood where that different times we collectively are open to different things. I think there was a time where we were really interested in, okay, like React has brought these new ideas that are now like spawning a bunch of other new ideas, really into exploring what can Svelte do, what can Solid do, what are different approaches to these things, what are these different frameworks. And there was like a lot of energy around that stuff. And I think it's taken longer than people had the patience for that stuff to stabilize or like even get adoption. Maybe they didn't get as much adoption as people wanted and the ecosystems around them, et cetera. So I feel like now we're in a phase where the mood is, I'm like tired of experimenting. Like I just want like stuff to work and be straightforward and have the tools I need. But that like doesn't exist anymore because React is also in this like crazy phase where they're like trying some wild different stuff. I don't think it's going well. So I think my sense of it is everyone's kind of unsatisfied in that like they just want to like be able to do their stuff and there isn't really anything that's that boring in the space right now.
Interesting. Okay. Do you think you said like the React stuff's not going well? Like, do you think server components? I'm like, is it going to be a major part of how all apps are built in or all React apps are built in 2 or 3 years? Or do you think it's going to like sort of fade a little bit? And, you know, some people use it, but it's most people are going to be doing more SPA type stuff.
Yeah, I think there's definitely interesting paradigms. And if you look at what's in React, server components are interesting. And there's definitely places where it's going to be really cool. I think then bringing that to people through Next, there's like that whole process. I think Next has done a horrible job of that. I think their implementation is really confusing, really buggy, really hard to understand. And if you just look at people trying to adopt this stuff, it hasn't been going well. And then you look at, okay, what benefit are they actually getting? Like, I'm not really sure about that. So I don't, yeah, it's like I said, we're in this weird phase where that is really experimental, but it's pitched as this is definitely the future of web. I'm kind of skeptical about that still. Like I build, like I work on web stuff a lot. I do a lot of front end work. I haven't really seen how it's going to meaningfully change the parts of the place where I struggle. Again, I work on productivity applications that people use for several hours a day when they're using them. Quite different than like the heritage of Next.js, which is e-commerce sites, things that are short-lived. They really want to pitch the idea that it's great for everything, but I don't know. I don't really see that. The stuff I'm excited about on the front end really has nothing to do with rendering it on the server.
Yeah. What are you excited about on the front end?
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing I talk about all the time is this local first stuff. So I think that's addressing a lot of the real problems that I have building like apps that feel good to use. The SC console is fully local first. I wouldn't say it's like a great implementation of it. I think it's like good for our like first experience doing something like that with it. But yeah, for productivity applications, like stuff just needs to feel good and stuff needs to feel fast. And the whole model when you switch to local first is actually a lot simpler. So Liz is, my wife is learning, she's been getting way more hands-on with building products. She's like actually coding and she's entirely focusing on front end. But what's great about our local first setup there is all the data is just there for her to work with. She's not like learning, how do I fetch from the server? Like what API input? She's not like redoing that with every feature. The data is just there and she can access it as a much simpler model. So I think the results are quite good. I think it's still pretty hard to build a local first app. Like there's a lot you need to know and set up on the back end and the syncing, and you like run into distributed systems problems basically because it's like you're treating your browser as another node in your database. But that's what's more exciting for me. I think the results really speak for themselves. But yeah, this RSC stuff, this Next.js stuff, it's just getting so crazy complicated. When I look at Next before all this stuff, like the pages router and all that stuff, I think it's a good framework. I actually think it's a good framework, and I would never make fun of it. Now I make fun of it every single day because it just, I think the whole industry is like lost on this.
Interesting. Like, how do you think that's going to shake out? Like, will there be some sort of backtracking there, or is it just like, man, we're going to like forge through this all stuff, and eventually it's going to get ironed out, but it's going to take a lot of pain on the way.
I think when you reach default status, it's very hard to screw it up, even if you do all the wrong things. So React is a default choice, and Next is a default choice for React apps. People just will always pick it and just do whatever the docs tell them to do and not really think too hard. We talk to people that when we ask them what they're using, they say React, but they mean Next, and they don't really even understand there's a difference between these two. They just think Next is React. So achieving default status for something is a crazy accomplishment. It's awesome to get there because you like literally can't screw it up. So I just feel like, yeah, they're going to keep going and people are going to do it. I think it's going to be a lot of like, I feel like nothing really is going to happen. Nothing really going to matter. It's just going to be a lot more energy spent on this stuff than is needed.
Yep. Do you, at SST, do you get a lot of like Vercel migrations? Do a lot of people come and say Vercel's not working with us for whatever reason, and we basically want to run our next app on? I know you have OpenNext and all that stuff. Like, do you see a lot of energy from that, or is it sort of all over?
Yeah, we do see a good amount of that stuff. I think when people come to us with that, our first reaction is like, are you sure? Like, you maybe should just stay on Vercel. Like, Next really only works properly there. We do our best to get it working elsewhere. But like, that's the thing. If you're going to choose Next, you're choosing to use Vercel. Like, that's kind of the reality of it. So we try to get people, we try to really understand why they're moving. Oftentimes it's like kind of ridiculous costs. Like, costs that just make no sense at all. But I think a lot of it is just, as much as the energy around Next is like, this is your application, like this is like the biggest part, most important part of your application. For most companies, it is like 10% of their application. And then the most important parts, their backend, is not anywhere near Vercel. It can never be on Vercel. So it's more like, it's more begrudging of being like, we don't like want to just move like just one part of our application into Vercel while the rest of it's somewhere else, and all disconnect. Again, switching between mental models, it's not great. So when we see people deploy Next.js through SST, it tends to be more because they have a big backend somewhere else. Gotcha.
What's the status on OpenNext? Like, does that require a ton of like active work, or is it like pretty well stable? I guess like, yeah, what does that look like?
It's a very tedious thing, but it's like very community run at this point. For a project like that, it has to be, because it's all about handling edge cases in different scenarios. So there's a community of people that use it. With every release, with every new Next.js release, they find some things that break. The giant test suite that tests all these random cases that we've seen come up, and just figuring out workarounds. A lot of it is just documentation, where it's always like, I'm getting this error, and then we explain to them, this is happening because of this. There's no solution. It's usually something like that. There's some weird stuff, man. It's like, the thing that really gets me is, if you use Next.js, you follow docs and use it and deploy it to a container, you'll start to get errors that you should only see on Cloudflare. Like, you deploy it to a Node.js container, and all of a sudden you're seeing like, error, you can't use this API. You can't use this Node.js API. Like, you can't use process. You can't import from process. You can't use process.env. And that's like so bizarre as to someone, again, these people aren't like tapped into the latest news. They're not tapped into Vercel. They're just picking Next as default. And all of a sudden they're like, what do you mean I can't use process.env? Like, how does that make, it's impossible to explain to people, right? But again, it's because Next is very developed around Vercel's setup. And like, yeah, like they run their middleware in Cloudflare. So they like hard coded all these constraints, which make no sense for the average user. So it's kind of what I mean by complexity. It's like, none of this is worth it. Like, it's not worth it for the average person using Next. Like, you get exposed to all this like weird stuff that's going on.
Yep. Okay. Are there any non-AWS, non-Cloudflare infrastructure providers that you use? I guess PlanetScale.
PlanetScale, yeah. I'm trying to think. I think for all of my projects, the thing that I've added is Cloudflare and PlanetScale, and then everything else is AWS. So for myself, no. We started seeing people start to use Azure.
Really?
Which
okay.
maybe it's just for some of this AI stuff that they have. But someone was asking us for an Azure, because we need to store your state somewhere. And right now we can store in AWS or in Cloudflare. Someone was asking us the other day for Azure state. So people are using it for other things. GCP basically never gets mentioned, like at all. It never gets brought up. Azure does get brought up. GCP literally never, no one's ever asked us about that.
And then any like third-party SaaS, like, Clerk or Ingest or like all those sorts of things, like not those specific ones, but like any other things that you use, or you're just like, hey, I want to use the primitives on AWS mostly?
No, I think our entire positioning, so our like positioning is I would say a contrarian bet around where all the investment is going. So if you look at these unbundlers, is what we call them, like Ingest pulls out one feature of AWS and just focuses all their resources on it. Resend pulls out email, focuses all their energy on email. So there's a ton of investment in that category. A lot of it is because Vercel got so big and people see this as like investing more into that ecosystem. We're basically taking the opposite bet. We're saying that all of those will fail, and any companies that would give them revenue will eventually eject from those things. And there's so many reasons why we can argue that. We might be wrong, but we're basically on the other side of the bet of saying all these one-off SaaS things are like, they're all going to like fail together in the same way.
Yeah, interesting. Do you think, is Vercel too big to fail, or like will Vercel kind of fail as well?
I don't think they'll fail. I think they will always be around. But I'm skeptical that they're like a public company. I don't see how they, and from the behavior I've seen in the last year, it seems like they've brought on someone that's shaping them up to try to go public. The giveaway is
like a CFO or something like that, like that's been in a public company.
I don't know about any details, but the thing that sticks out to me is all these tiny little pricing adjustments for the most trivial places where like they're basically reconfiguring a bunch of stuff to make their financials look better. That's what it screams to me. I don't really see how the public market, especially right now, is interested in them. So yeah, I don't think they'll die. I just don't see how, they get to the next level.
Yeah, for sure. Are there AWS services you won't use? And like, I'd say specifically like popular ones that some people do like, and you're just like, no, that's a hard no for me.
Step functions, probably.
Yeah.
I don't know how popular that is, but again, I've tried a bunch. It
definitely had a lot of energy for a while, and it's just like, yeah, it's a tough model, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my sense around all this stuff is when I was getting into the AWS stuff, I think that was around the time where it was like peak all of that, like all of this like really AWS intense ways you could build stuff.
Yeah.
So I had to learn
like
that
the
extreme.
API, like the direct service integrations and API gateway, all that goofy stuff.
Remember Adam was using VTL, was a VTL? His like whole application was like VTL templates or whatever. Yeah. So it was like that extreme. And I think it was cool to see like what that was like. But I think now we've shifted back to, okay, like a lot of these infrastructure primitives are great, but like use them in a dumber way. Like don't try to like have all your business logic live there. Again, people still do it the other way. But yeah, for me, it's just like anything where my business logic or the code I'm writing is kind of existing inside the AWS space. It just doesn't work out for me.
Yeah. Switching gears a little bit on just like marketing to devs. I think you've had some strong opinions in the past of just like a lot of people are doing it wrong. I think SST, like you yourself, and then SST has done it well. I guess like, what do you see about what works for marketing to devs?
Yeah, I think the root insight we had was not all, but if you're like pretty, if you spend a bunch of time building companies, you know that when you work on product, you have to go for really big swings that have a shot at being huge. Most of the time, you're going to be wrong, but you need to at least, like, there needs to at least be a plausible shot that this is something that's going to end up in the hands of a lot of people, right? And that's how you focus on product. For some reason, when it comes to marketing, we like forget that mindset and we just spend time on things that never has a shot of reaching a lot of people. So for us, and this is so hard, even though we've been thinking this way for years now, we still revert to doing the stuff that can never be big. It's just like such a default state of being. If you look at a lot of dev tool companies, they launch a new feature, they will publish a 30-minute video going over using the feature. And that will be seen by, I'll get like a couple hundred views. That no matter what, you can execute on that like amazingly. It's never going to be something someone sees and like sends their coworkers being like, you have to check this out right now, right? It never is a shot at being huge. So for us with marketing, we're like, let's try never doing anything that never has a shot at that. So let's only try to make stuff that people will share. Like we don't always succeed. I think often we fail, but it could have worked, right? So I think a lot with marketing, top of the funnel needs to be the same way any other company markets, even outside of dev tools, which is you go for the biggest numbers possible. I think there's just this habit, again, like I said, we revert to it too, of just like putting out release notes, putting out a blog post summarizing what's in the release. Like you're never reaching new people with that. Like no one's excited to read that. No one's sharing that. So I think like having that click was pretty big for us. And the other side of it is, I really don't think this is a full-time role. I struggle to point to anyone that is purely doing this, that's not heavily working on the product. Because if you go further down the funnel, a lot of it comes down to credibility and trust. The reach we have, I talk about a lot of things. I don't just talk about SST. I talk about like all kinds of things that I spend a lot of time in, and people follow me for those things. And hopefully like they develop trust with me because I'm genuinely talking about this stuff. I'm not just talking about my product every single day. I'd say maybe I talk about it like 1 in 5. And it's not artificial, it's genuine. Like I only want to talk about it 1 in 5 because all this other stuff I also want to talk about. So it's hard for someone to like their role just to be marketing and they're not spending every day building stuff. They're not spending every day working on their own product. It's really hard to come off as an expert, which is what people really care about.
Yeah. Yep. For this new Ion release, you're talking about making a video. Will it be like some of the funny videos you had in the past, like free Next.js and things like that? Or like what's that going to look like?
So we did it. So when we launched Ion, I did like a 3-minute video where it's like a fake documentary thing where I like really do a poor job selling Ion on purpose. So that was like our funny take on it. So this one, we're actually not going to do that. We're going to do, again, with this terminal coffee thing, weirdly, it ended up using like every possible feature of SST to the extreme, which makes sense because me and Adam worked on it, of course. So this is going to be a little bit more traditional in that we're going to go over how we built it and like every single detail, all the way from basic stuff like the API and the front end, but also things like our internal dashboard and like how we set that up and our operations and then all that. So I'm going to try to make a video of like, here's this fully crazy thing we built. It uses AWS, it uses containers, it uses functions, it uses Cloudflare, it uses workers, it uses like, it like really stretches everything we can do. So I want to do like an in-depth like explanation of that code base. We're going to open source all of it. So again, like we don't expect that one to do that well, but that one's a little bit more traditional, but you still see how it's like not just a straight up explanation of our thing.
And it's still like, yeah, it's not just like, hey, we have this feature and this feature and this feature. It's like you're kind of nerd sniping a little bit and saying like, this is how you actually build something. And like, I think people will like a walkthrough of, an actual code base, especially something as unique as terminal, so.
Yeah. It's like we built a coffee shop in a terminal, right? That's a little bit more interesting than the traditional application.
Yep. How you used to stream some. Why did you stop streaming? Is it just like too time consuming, or like not effective at like sort of marketing type stuff, or yeah?
No, I miss streaming and I need to get back to it. I think the thing with streaming is I think it puts you into a good rhythm and mindset. So when I was doing it every single day, I felt just very connected with a community, not the biggest community, but a community, and that like feeds into the other places. It's like your biggest fans show up there. And it's weird to this day. Like I was talking to someone from Experian the other day, massive company, like so many people, like just all over the world. And one of them was like, "Oh, you're going to start streaming again." And I was like, this was really surprising to me because they're like the most corporate, like it's like the other extreme side of tech that you never see. And this person like watched my streams and mentioned it. So it's good in that like it's the most intimate thing you can do. And people do watch if they might have it on the background, etc. The reason I stopped is I can only do this with certain kind of work. Cranking on Ion and Ion internals, multiplexer, like I'm not good. So like I think Prime could do this where you can work on something crazy and also be streaming. I think I'm okay at that, but I'm not at the level where I'm going to be that productive doing both. I think you have Adam who's at the other extreme where he just cannot do both at all, but he still does it. So I'm going to get back to it once we're done, like with this core Ion stuff, and it's more like me working on our console or me moving the console from V2 to Ion. That's like stuff that I can stream. Now, as I said, the last thing is the reason I started streaming is because I just committed to doing it every single day because it gets you good at talking and thinking at the same time with like all the distractions. And I found that I was just a lot more comfortable in all kinds of situations after doing that. So I want to get back to it because it's good practice for all of that.
Yeah, interesting. Do you think like has tech streaming gone down? Like obviously Prime is huge, but it seemed like there was a moment where like a lot of people were streaming and now there's fewer. I don't know if that's just like my circle of people that I knew or like has it sort of dropped off a little bit?
I think when Prime got big and a bunch of people in the world got big, there was like a bunch of interest, which is kind of when I jumped onto it. I think a bunch of people jumped onto it. So yeah, I think there's definitely, I feel like that phase is over. Again, it's like one of those things where it's a lot of effort and it's only going to be big if it's like your full-time job, like it is for Prime. So it's like, only a few people really are going to end up there, but it's still growing. Like his numbers are crazy. Like now he's doing stuff on Instagram and he's gotten like insane numbers on Instagram now too. So yeah, there's a lot of engineers in the world.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Hey, Dax, thanks for coming on. This has been great. I'd love to learn all this stuff for you. I guess like, where can people learn more about Ion? Where can people find you? Anything else you wanna plug?
Yeah, so our website, st.dev, we're working on a new landing page today. I think we'll maybe get it out. Nothing crazy. It's going to be like a single pager. And then me on Twitter, THDXR. You can find me there. As Alex warned you at the beginning, you will be insulted. Like 3 out of 5 posts, I will be probably insulting you, but the other 2 are maybe serious.
It's good stuff. I love it. And also like your podcast with Adam, tomorrow.fm.
I always forget to plug that.
Yeah, it's good.
Adam's always messaging, being like, remember the podcast.
Yeah. So there you go, Adam. I got it for you. So cool. Dax, thanks for coming on. Best of luck with Ion and all that stuff. And I'll see you around.
Cool.